I hope everyone can hear me. Somebody yell if you can't. My name's Mary. I'm going to be chairing this meeting. I'm a member of Norwich Socialist Workers' Party. Welcome very much to our meeting this week, which is entitled The Egyptian Revolution, Why It Matters 10 Years On. And I guess some of us are thinking, my God, is it 10 years between now and those events that happened in Egypt, and what happened and what is going on now in Egypt? And we're going to start off with a very short video, and then when we come back after that, I'll introduce the speaker. The other thing to say is that you're all muted at the minute, but that's because we're just starting the meeting, and you will be able to contribute later on, but I'll explain that in a second. So I think Tim's going to put a little video up for us to give you a flavour of what's happening.
Headmaster who was cruel and had banned a football tournament a year before the revolution was forced to quit. The football tournament was reinstated. Bullies in the playground were forced to flee. They called them the Shatar, or police, and they were no longer able to bully other children. And students would regularly walk out of class if teachers yelled at them. One of the young students, socialist worker production on the Egyptian Revolution. Many people believe revolutions are violent and very bloody. It's often something you hear from people in mass movements, that they want to be peaceful and that revolutions always lead to bloodshed. This is something that's cultivated by our rulers to discourage us from rebelling and trying to overthrow them. However, the Egyptian revolution shows us that actually revolutions involve the lives of millions of working class and ordinary people, and touches every aspect of society, including children's lives, as this story of the Zewat Dashar school in Cairo illustrates.
Many years after the defeated revolution, a playground in Egypt rang out with the sounds of children marching and chanting. At first it was thought they were chanting a slogan from the revolution, "The people want the downfall of the field marshal." But a closer listen revealed it was not the regime they were demanding the downfall of, but the headmaster, El Moshir. They were not just copying, but applying the revolution's lessons to their own injustice.
And they were successful. The headmaster who was cruel and had banned a football tournament a year before the revolution was forced to quit. The football tournament was reinstated. Bullies in the playground were forced to flee. They called them the Shatar, or police, and they were no longer able to bully other children. And students would regularly walk out of class if teachers yelled at them. One of the young students told a Guardian journalist in 2016, "We saw the revolution on the television, and we learned that if you want to change something in your life, this is what you do."
Revolutions matter not only because of what they show the rest of us, but especially because of the deep lessons they engrave into the hearts and souls of those who take part. Come and join us, 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, the 10th of February, as we celebrate one such act in Tahrir Square, Egypt, which happened a mere 10 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Can everyone hear me? We're going to start the meeting now. Like I've said, welcome to the meeting. The video gives you some idea of the enormity of the situation in Egypt and the millions of people who took part in it. I've got an apology from Salah, who is one of our speakers tonight. Salah is an Egyptian who was part of the revolution, but is now living effectively as a refugee and exile in Britain, but has made his home here. And he's apologized because he had to go to work. When you have to work, you have to work. So he's working till 11 tonight. But that means we have more time for our main speaker, who is Russ Chandler, who's from Walthamstow branch in London, used to live in Norwich. So he says it's nice to be back home. And he's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then after he's finished, then we will have, you'll be unmuted when you want to speak, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. But start with questions after Russ has spoken, and then maybe people can chip in with other experiences and contributions as they'd like. So welcome, Russ, you're on.
Thank you very much, comrades. And yes, it's always, don't let my accent fool you. I'm Norwich born and bred. It's always nice to pay a visit to my hometown, even if that's just virtually for the moment. As we saw from that rather lovely video, the sheer scale of what happened in Egypt 10 years ago to the very day when millions of people took to the streets of Egypt to challenge and ultimately to overthrow a corrupt dictator. However, as the revolution developed, their rage became more than just the deposing of a tyrant. It became a genuinely revolutionary challenge to the entire system. Ultimately, the challenge failed, but I think it should be celebrated as an example of what ordinary people are capable of when we stand together. And more than that, I think that it needs to be studied for the lessons it has for us as we struggle towards our own liberation. In fact, the account of the revolution I'm going to give is relatively brief because I just think that there's so much to discuss in terms of the lessons to be learnt from it. Revolutionary uprisings are often seen as spontaneous. And although it's really important to understand that masses of people can behave spontaneously, often these so-called spontaneous uprisings, they just seem to be spontaneous because nobody's paying any attention to what is actually happening below the surface of a society. And this is one such example. Hosni Mubarak was one nasty bastard. Ruler of Egypt since 1979, he was a loyal servant to the Western imperialist powers and a firm ally of Israel. His regime was corrupt, brutal and nepotistic. He introduced a savage neoliberal economic policy that impoverished millions of Egyptians, and any dissent was met with murderous violence. Partly inspired by the Palestinian Intifada of 2000 and the global anti-war movement of 2003, resistance to Mubarak grew throughout the first decade of the century. There were strikes and protests over housing issues, religious discrimination, and many other issues. In June 2010, a 28-year-old activist, Khalid Mohammed Saeed, was brutally murdered in police custody. This probably wouldn't have raised too much of an eyebrow in previous years, but this time around it seemed to reach some kind of tipping point. Pictures of his disfigured face were widely shared on social media, and it provided a rallying point for people sickened by the regime. I suggest that you don't Google to look at the pictures. They are absolutely appalling. January 25th, 2011 was designated National Police Day. But rather than a celebration of the murderous Egyptian police force, opposition groups declared it a day of anger. Tens of thousands of protesters came out into the streets right across Egypt. Over the next few days, the numbers grew to hundreds of thousands. The police fought back with tear gas, rubber bullets and live rounds. The phones and the internet were cut. The Egyptian revolution is sometimes referred to as the Facebook revolution because it was the first one in which social media played a large organising role. In fact, social media did play an organising role, but it was by no means decisive because they cut the internet off when things got hot. The demonstrators fought fiercely. And as these battles grew, ultimately millions of people came out onto the streets. It all comes down to numbers. If you know when you've been on a demonstration, if there's 50 of us and 100 cops, we do what we're told. If there's 100 cops and 2,000 of us, the police, as Wayman Bennett says, all of a sudden the police stopped calling him Wayman and start calling him Mr. Bennett. This was on a massively bigger scale. Millions of people came onto the streets and forced the security forces to flee. Ultimately, 2 million people occupied Tahrir Square, which was in downtown Cairo, which was to become the spiritual centre of the revolution. Now, mass uprisings can frighten the life out of the bosses, but the bosses are generally able to weather the storm. The knockout punch for the old regime happened when the uprising spread to the organised working class. Over this period, as a direct result of this uprising, there were strikes in every sector of the economy. Tens of thousands of workers walked out of offices, factories, textile mills, ports, hospitals, schools and universities across Egypt. Even the cops came out. In the first week of February, some 300,000 Egyptians were on strike. The Egyptian army was a key component of Egypt's role supporting US interests in the Middle East under Mubarak. The army was loyal to the dictator, but it also had its own economic interests, controlling vast swathes of manufacturing and agriculture that made up about 20% of the Egyptian economy. As the uprising started to pull the loyalty of soldiers from working class and peasant backgrounds, the strike wave started to threaten the very basis of the economy. The army moved in and removed Mubarak from office. On the 11th of February 2011, Hosni Mubarak resigned. People won, tyrants nil. This is clearly an extremely quick summary of a series of very complicated events. But I think that there are so many political lessons that come out of the story of the Egyptian revolution that I think it'll be an interesting discussion, and I want to focus on just a few of them. The first was why what happened in January 2011 was a revolutionary situation and not simply a mass uprising or a series of demonstrations. What was qualitatively different about this situation? Well, the dissatisfaction with the Mubarak regime was not limited to one section of society or to any specific economic demands. The regime's neoliberal economic policies had seen the wages of the poorest stagnate for decades. Middle-class kids were coming out of university to find a total absence of career opportunities, and the nepotistic corruption of the regime was widely resented, as was the routine brutality of the Copts. The Coptic Christian minority also protested against discrimination and at the height and religious sectarian violence. And at the height of the uprising, many mosques refused to condemn the protesters. It was what Russian revolutionary Lenin described as a festival of the oppressed, a generalized discontent. Lenin said that for a revolution to happen, two things need to occur. One is that the old order can no longer govern in the old way. And the second is that the people are no longer willing to be governed in the old way. This is what happened in Egypt in 2011. If you look at what's happening in this country at the moment, it's quite clear that the ruling classes cannot govern in the old way. They are in absolute crisis. They cannot get their way out of the various messes that they are in. But at this point, the people on the streets, the ordinary people, are not resisting. So you've only got one half of that equation. However, whilst the mass uprising and street fighting that characterised the early days of the uprising and the magnificent symbol of 2 million people standing together in Tahrir Square frightened the life out of the regime and provided a beacon of hope and inspiration throughout the world, ultimately it was the mass strike wave that forced the downfall of the regime. Now, mass movements are incredibly important. We always support mass movements, we agitate, we build them. But as a rule, a regime can manage an uprising, no matter how big it is. They can contain it, let it run its course. They can offer concessions to it, or ultimately they can just shoot the demonstrators and start again. But mass strikes challenge the very basis of the system. Now, Two cities at either end of the Suez Canal, Suez and Port Said, were key centres of the uprising. At that point, 8% of the world's seaborne trade passed through the Suez Canal, including 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. The workers of Egypt had intervened in the global capitalist system and threatened it. It was far, far more significant than a demonstration of any size. This was a direct intervention in the global capitalist system by the organised working class. Workers' power is at the point of production. Marxism's focus on the working class is not a sentimental or moralistic position. It's based on the fact that under capitalism, the organised working class is the only group that has the weapons to fundamentally challenge the system. However, the ability to challenge the system is not something that happens spontaneously, and the ruling class has many more tactics up its sleeve. In Egypt, the mass movement had overthrown the tyrant Mubarak. No doubt about that. He went because of the mass movement on the street and in the workplaces. But who was going to replace him? In the event, the army stepped into the breach, portraying themselves as neutral peacemakers, helping pave the way to a peaceful democratic order. They aligned themselves with the main opposition party in Egypt, the Islamicist Muslim Brotherhood, who in return diffused the rebellion on the streets and at the same time protected the army's economic interests. After a couple of years, when it became clear that the Muslim Brotherhood was unable to deliver meaningful reforms to solve the issues and injustices that had fueled the uprising in the first place, or were able to suppress the dissent that had fueled that uprising, in 2013, the army formed an alliance with liberal left and Arab nationalist forces and staged a coup, notionally dressed up as an attack on Islamicism. However, once completed, the army under the leadership of General al-Sisi turned around, massacred its liberal and progressive allies and installed a military dictatorship every bit as brutal as Mubarak's. The ruling class, the big bosses, the bankers, the military, all have very sophisticated formal strategies to maintain their power. In this country, we see it really clearly because they don't send their kids to Eton and spend all that money in order to give them an excellent education in the arts. It is a training school for the ruling elite. The ordinary folks in a revolutionary situation don't have that. We've got our anger and we have our demands, but don't usually have a formal, organised structure that can actually take on the might of the bourgeoisie. For that to happen, we need to be organised into a formal party. Party gets confused because it's often used. People think of it as a synonym for electoral parties like the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. That's one use of the word party. Party just means people grouped together for a political end. An organisation, a party can be an organisation which has the resources and tactical understanding to use the power of the workers in an effective and disciplined way. This is a workers' party, a revolutionary party. In February 1917, the revolution in Russia overthrew the corrupt and despotic Tsar and replaced him with a liberal reforming government. When they couldn't deliver the changes demanded by the workers, the Bolshevik Party was able to organise the angry workers to overthrow the entire system in the October Revolution. Although there are many differences, you can see how this revolutionary leadership was missing in Egypt. And it's really, it's important to realise that the absence of a revolutionary party to the leadership of the working class and then strategically organise them against the might of the bourgeoisie is vital in revolutionary moments, and it was missing in Egypt. Point to make here is that when I talk about leadership, leadership means winning arguments, not following orders. Although in a revolutionary situation, discipline is very important too. Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, said that mass uprisings are like steam. They're like the movement giving off steam. And if you put that out into the open, the steam simply dissipates. The anger just melts away, it burns off. But if you can take that steam and put it into a piston, it can drive an engine. And the Revolutionary Party is that engine. It takes that anger and it focuses it and challenges it. There was a revolutionary socialist party in Egypt, but it was too small to have an influence over the events. If we imagine a situation where we had a series of mass uprisings spontaneously happening in this country, say we've got 1 million people in Chapelfield Gardens, would the SWP be able to gain influence within that movement? It's a question. If you read Ian Birchall's biography of Tony Cliff, he talks about the uprisings that happened in 1968 and how the IS, the precursor to the SWP in those days, was tiny, but it was just big enough to be able to intervene in those struggles and get a foothold. They would only have had to have a few less people and they would have been just swept away by events. What we're not trying to do is to convert people en masse to our ideas and from there move seamlessly to a revolutionary situation. Of course, we try and convince as many people as we possibly can of our ideas, our tactics and our strategies. But ultimately, workers learn to become revolutionary in the process of the revolution. They learn to feel their power and the practical experiences of organizing themselves. There was an author, Adif Soleif, who told Socialist Worker back in 2011, the revolution has set loose a giant creative energy with slogans, chants, stand-up comedy and street art. It showed how ordinary people can run things from themselves. Volunteers organized in Tahrir Square they organized their own security services to keep out the undercover cops. Doctors helped those injured fighting the regime's forces. Teachers gave lessons in the square. The video that we watched before I started speaking had that lovely example of years after the revolution. The kids in the school learning what had happened from what they'd seen and starting to understand their own collective power. The role of the party is to build connections in the movement and the unions and in the organised working class to be in a position to warn against the traps and tactical mistakes that can happen in a revolutionary period and fight for the maximum level of change available. One other point that needs to be made is that this can't be done in the heat of a revolution. Party building needs to be done in advance. Historically, the great example of that is Rosa Luxemburg, who left it far too late to start her own party, the Spartacus League, and was ultimately overpowered by events. But this is what we try to do in the SWP. It's worth remembering that selling papers on a miserable, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go and sell papers on a picket line is part of this process we have of building our influence, of building our reputation, so that when the upsurge of mass uprisings happen, we will be in a position to have attention paid to us, to have our arguments listened to, and to fight for leadership of that organization, of that movement. Although I must say that I'm rather nostalgic these days for getting up at 5 in the morning and selling papers on a picket line. I never thought I would say that. Now, the counter-revolution in Egypt, which is what it was when the army used classic ruling class tactics, they aligned with one side, and once their use for that was finished, they massacred their allies and moved on to something else. It was led to a situation in Egypt today, which is in many ways worse for ordinary people than it was under Mubarak. Does that mean they should not have risen up? Does that mean that the revolution was a bad idea? Well, I'm going to argue no, because I think two things. A, their heroic efforts serve as a beacon of inspiration for oppressed people all over the world. It tells us that it is possible for us to come out, to stand together and to force profound and meaningful change in society. And for all that it was ultimately defeated, the 18 days in Tahrir Square, the 18 days of the Egyptian uprising, has given us invaluable insights into how the next revolution can be victorious. Revolution is a process. Lenin again said, anyone who expects to see a perfect revolution will never live to see it. Revolutions, ultimately the successful revolution will be built on the unsuccessful ones. not necessarily very comforting if you're in the middle of an unsuccessful one, but I think we should absolutely celebrate and cherish and value not only the inspiration but the insights that the Egyptian revolution gave to us. Revolution is not easy, but let's face it, the world we live in today is an absolute disaster, and we have a world to win. Okay, I'll leave it there. What do we think?
Thank you very, very much, Ross. That was very comprehensive. So there's lots of us to talk about. I'm going to start off by asking people if they'd like to ask a question. If you've got a question to ask, then please raise your hand. If you, I think most people know how to do it on the Zoom facilities, because I can't see you all at the minute, so I won't know unless you do that. But otherwise, just wave at me at some point. Okay. I don't see any hands at the minute. So.
Hey, as you know, Salah's in our branch, and he was in Tahrir Square, and with a lot of what he does now is formed by the revolution, and he's a fantastic anti-racist, and he's a writer at UEA, and he's working on a project, and he wanted me to read a couple of messages, so I'll read them now. One's a poem. He's working on a project about home and homeland, and he's working on it with artists and writers at UEA. This is a poem about homeland. The homeland is not a song that we just sing for it. The homeland is a responsibility. We must all take it. We must keep it from the disloyalty of the time and protect it from all adversities. To have a homeland that the sun could rise above it. The homeland is by its citizens and its lovers, not just by the cedar and the collection of soil. He is our father and our mother, and it is the collector of all people, and without it we are foreigners. We cannot leave our homeland. We are for it, and it is for us. All my grandfathers lived in it, and they have written its glorious stories. If its sons couldn't be with it, who will keep our future then? And then I asked Salah, what was the impact of the revolution on him? And he said, freedom, justice, equality, and democracy. And he's forged by the revolution, and we're really glad to have him in our branch. And real international solidarity there.
Catherine was talking about neoliberalism as a political choice. I don't think that's quite the whole story. Neoliberalism is a set of political choices, yes, but within quite a restrictive economic framework, which is the economic framework of capitalism. Capitalism is ultimately an anarchic setup. It's an anarchic form of production. And since the war, for example, we had the long boom from the 1940s up until the end of the 1960s, which was a specific and untypical period of capitalism. But since 1973 or so, capitalism in its classic sense has reasserted itself with a series of increasingly damaging and brutal crises, and in between the crises, an ongoing drop in the level of profit, the level of money that's actually available in the economy. Now, neoliberalism is one response to that, but the responses to that in bourgeois terms are quite limited. What they can't do is go back to some kind of post-war Keynesianism or whatever. Simply, there isn't the money available to do that. They haven't got the resources to buy us off in the way that they could have done perhaps in the 1950s and 1960s, even in the 1980s, 1990s. I think if you taking from that on, Tim was quite interesting talking about, say the reforms that happened after World War II. There's the very sentimental attachment to the Labour Party of 1945 as being this all-encompassing sort of glorious socialist movement. But the fact of the matter was that in 1945, even the banks even the Tories wanted the banks nationalised. It was total economic sense from all points of view. So they were able to do that. in a way that wasn't controversial. I'd like to nationalise the banks regardless of what the Tories think. Tim also said that, or made the point about the Bolsheviks being able to organise themselves in illegal and oppressive conditions. I think it's worth pointing out that the SWP is not actually supposed to be the final revolutionary party. The SWP is very much structured for a revolutionary party in a time of low class struggle. And I think that we would change our structures quite radically should we enter a period of illegality, and it could happen at some point as we move towards a revolutionary procedure. There are a revolutionary situation, and there are lots of different ways that a political party can organize itself in conditions of illegality. If you've ever seen the movie Battle of Algiers, absolutely fantastic film, and it talks about, you can see there a cell type organization which with the best will in the world they can't penetrate. Anthony was talking about the Bolsheviks and police spies and so on. I think the legend is, of course, that they discovered that after the revolution there were several entire Bolshevik party branches that were entirely made up of police spies. Cliff always apparently used to say that police informants, infiltrators are brilliant because they turn up on time and they've always got a car. So make sure you work them really hard, which of course is an attitude you can take when you work legally, like we do at the moment. Things may be a bit different if you have to work illegally. And I think just to finish off, I think what was Hugh was really interesting, talking about Black Lives Matter, great example of the struggles continuing. I think BLM is a really interesting example because you had this massive, spontaneous uprising that happened a year or so ago, and it was so big that the authorities, the states globally, had to take notice of them, especially, again, in the States when it started to spread towards strike action, although it happened to be in sports rather than kind of the generalized strike action. There were some baseball teams and whatever. But the fact of the matter was BLM was so big that it rattled the authorities. And what the authorities then did, what the state did, is it went to BLM and said, what do you want? You've got our attention. What do you want? And it forces Black Lives Matter to take a political stance. And they came up with the political slogan, which they're based around, which is defund the police, which is important because that's a political slogan that has a lot of implications about what's the role of the police in society. And from that, what's the role of society towards the individual. Already you can see the concessions are being made, and Black Lives Matter, there is a strand in Black Lives Matter of the kind of liberal reformists who are going to accept what is offered to them, which will ultimately, it may lead to improvements for people of color, but it's not going to ultimately lead to their liberation. The only way that we can end racism is to end capitalism. But I think the final point to make is that, let's go back to the answer to Catherine's questions, they can't buy us off. Ultimately, the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, cannot buy off the workers indefinitely. The contradictions of being a worker constantly squeezed, oppressed and alienated under capitalism will always generate revolt. And under capitalism, where people are squashed together into cities, into huge factories, that is going to be collective. The nature of capitalism is that it will generate mass revolts and potentially mass revolutionary moments. The job as the SWP, our job as revolutionaries, is to learn the lessons and to implement the revolutionary party that will ultimately make the difference between that steam rising up and diffusing, or that piston that can drive an engine that can change the whole world. Thank you.